to Compromising Positions. I'm Leanne Potter, cyber anthropologist and head of security operations for a major retailer.
And I'm Jeff Watkins, a cybersecurity enthusiast and CTO for a major tech consultancy. Take a podcast that focuses on human-centric cybersecurity threats and how we can tackle them together.
In today's episode, we speak with Christian Hunt again, because he was so good we have to bring him into part 2. And he's the founder of Human Risk, a consultancy and training firm that specialises in ethics and compliance. So check out the fantastic insights in part 1 if you've not done so already.
In this episode, Christian explains that blanket bans do not work and how small acts of rebellion could be your downfall.
Christian also introduces his humans frameworks and explains how it can be applied to stopping people from clicking on unsolicited emails. So you're not going to want to miss this episode if your goal in your organisation is to stop people clicking on things they shouldn't.
So sit back and enjoy our second conversation with Christian Hunt on being human.
I think stupid rules actually are detrimental on 2 levels. One is because they don't capture everything and we pretend that they do. But the second thing is they piss people off. And so what you do is if you come across a stupid rule, you find a way around it. And therefore, actually, that's more dangerous because you've then effectively encouraged non-compliance. Whereas what you should be doing is finding out how can we create a safe environment that can work with us, recognizing that people are going to want to do the very things that we've hired them for in the first place.
Absolutely. And some workarounds are just so heavy-handed. I recall joining an organisation and I got really friendly with the developers very quickly as a cybersecurity person, which is exactly what you want. You want people to sort of tell you their sins, as it were. And they were just like, can you do something about Bluetooth? And I was like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, Bluetooth is completely banned from our devices. And so what we've been doing is we've been going online, we've been pulling a script from online that bypasses all the security controls. We don't know where the scripts come from, by the way. We just pulled it offline. And the only reason why we want Bluetooth is because we like to listen to music on our wireless headphones while we're coding. And I had to just go back to the security team and just be like, we need to lift this because this script, we have no idea what it's doing and we're actually preventing them from being productive. And there's just so many occasions in the workplace where what's the point of hiring good creative people if we don't trust them to make good decisions? Particularly in the technical space, I think we should give them, even more leeway than we would do. Sort of maybe the average user who isn't so technically minded, put a few more guardrails, a few more bits of training in place there. But people who are technically minded, that one-size-fits-all approach, I really just don't think works. And I think a lot of, we were talking about training earlier, things like security awareness, for example. When you do that once-a-year training, when you first start in an organisation, then once a year, every year since in your employment, it's the same training for every single person, regardless of what level you're at. And I just don't think it captures the nuances of different experiences, different expertise, and the different sort of cultural surroundings that those people are involved in dealing with your estate and the organisation. So I think it's a really interesting point you were making about giving people that autonomy, because they will just turn on you and will try and do other things, and those workarounds are so much more dangerous.
And I think there's an opportunity here as well, right? Which is if you allow people to tell you what they would like to do and can't, for whatever reason. Let's assume you've got things, because it's something you can't just sort of say, do what the hell you want and we'll worry about the rules after. But that's where the experimental mindset kicks in. I think if you introduce rules and restrictions, so the Bluetooth one would be a good example. Let's assume it was super well intentioned, right? And these things generally are super well intentioned. And you start off and say, okay, we've introduced this thing, release it, and then have a mechanism whereby people for whom that is a problem, and ideally do this before you introduce it, but a little bit like legislation, right? That you consult with people to find out what the impact of this is likely to be, and you review it to make sure that you've got it right. And I think the Bluetooth one's a good example where you could say, look, we're going to ban this and let's explain why. And let's explain it in simple language for people that are not, but people that are techie, right? That are interested. And Bluetooth's not a particularly techie thing, right? The vast majority of people probably have Bluetooth headphones. So it's something that we intuitively understand. But there'll be other things, maybe there's the introduction of a new browser that makes things easier for people or does something clever, or there's a bit of software that people want, or there's some sort of need that they have and you've blocked it. I think it's very smart to have a process where you can allow people to come and talk to you, not in a kind of they come and tell you and then you close another loophole but actually, how do you facilitate what it is they're trying to do? Now, it might be that you can't facilitate 100% what they want. You can find another path to allow them to do it, but recognize that you're going to get these things wrong. And so even if you've thought it through brilliantly, is the sort of feedback loop that you were talking about earlier, Leanne, is doesn't tend to exist except in an unofficial capacity. And the only way these things tend to change is you get senior people going, this rule is ridiculous, right? And it's be something that impacts them. So things like travel policy, expense policy, conflict of interest stuff, ability to access certain things, that tends to get changed because senior person shouts a lot. and therefore they get their work. And it always typically starts with, well, we'll just grant an exception for them, right? We'll let them have access to those websites and not everybody else. And I think that's a flawed approach. You should be recognized, every single human being. And I think it's particularly important where it applies to larger swathes of people, because actually, if you've got hundreds of people who have a problem with this, that's hundreds of brains who will be looking at ways to get around your rules, as opposed to the CEO that just can shout a lot because they probably haven't got the time to focus on some of these things. But if it's impacting every aspect of your day job, you're going to find ways around it. And so I'm a big fan of consulting, introducing ethical hacking. So get the very people who are likely to be irritated by your rules to come and talk to you and to show you how, and reward them for coming forward and showing you how they can get around your rules. Because again, you won't have designed it perfectly, and humans are ingenious at finding ways around problems. And so I think we need to create a culture of saying, we haven't nailed this down perfectly. We need your help with this. And actually, if you come to us and give us your help, that's not going to make your life tougher. It's going to make your life easier. And people they'll come forward with all sorts of things you hadn't even realized. And that using humans as an early warning system that way, I think is super powerful. And all of this, I think, involves around treating people like they're adults. Typically, we treat every single employee like they're the biggest master criminal out there, and they're up to no good all the time. A very small percentage will be up to no good, but what you do by chasing them is you irritate everybody else. And sometimes that's not worth doing. Catch the criminals out by other means, but work on the basis that everybody else is trying to do the right thing and is turning up to work, trying to be as effective as possible.
What you're describing there is a kind of a much more dynamic environment, much more agile and iterative, not trying to push it too much into a Scrum context, but much more iterative and collaborative way of working. And I think that is probably very far away from what people would imagine when they think about policies and rules and compliance. I mean, do you think cybersecurity professionals or cybersecurity teams would benefit from behavioral scientists or behavioral science training in their teams?
Yes, I think, and of course, right. Let's also declare my own bias here, right? This is the basis on the work that I do. So of course I'm going to say that, but let me explain. Yes, and let me explain why. Because if we are designing things for human beings, whether that's controls, processes, communication, the things that I used the proxy rules for earlier on, if we're designing that for human beings, wouldn't it be a good idea to have some understanding about how effective that is going to be? We don't. Let's take a totally different context. Let's think about animals, right? If we are trying to influence animals in some way, shape, or form, so that might be trying to heal them. We're in a different context where we're trying to influence. We research animals, and we don't put people in that position without having some understanding of it. If you're trying to be an architect, you have to understand the basic rules about how you do things, the laws of physics, engineering, all those sorts. And so I find it bizarre that we have lots of professions out there, and compliance is my flagship one, but I would extend it to other areas that are trying to do these things, where we do it on intuition. We do it on what we have always done, what seems sensible. But when we look at other contexts, in marketing, the obvious example, we know that often what's effective at influencing human decision-making is illogical, is pointless. Go back to COVID. One of the lessons that was fascinating for me was every single person in the world suddenly understood what compliance was. Not because they'd never experienced anything, but it was suddenly there because we were all faced with a massive set of rules, principles, cross your fingers and pray type exhortations by government to change the way, fundamentally change the way that we behave in many aspects. And we all experienced things where we went, well, that's it. That's ridiculous. That's irritating. Okay, I'm prepared to accept that. We all had our tolerance thresholds for it, but we reacted to it, and we saw what was effective and what was ineffective. And to take the UK as an example, if I just say the two words Barnard Castle, everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Which is this. So just in case there are any listeners that don't, Dominic Cummings, who was the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson's advisor, probably stretching it too far because he was much more, he was basically right-hand man, almost the power behind the throne, you might think, broke COVID rules and then lied about it and basically went on national television trying to claim that he had some excuse for breaking rules that the vast majority of the population were abiding by. That, for me, is a classic example. We know what hypocrisy looks like. We understand those dynamics and the human dynamics behind it. And we know why that is so irritating. Not just the rule breaking, one law for them, another one for us, but the lying about it as well. Add all that together and you've got a visceral reaction to a compliance type situation. So we all understand that. And so given we've been through that experience, one of the things I say to anyone who's writing rules or trying to influence people is that you've got an instinctive understanding of what this is, when this is, when it feels awful, when it isn't working in the way that is intended and things that might go wrong. Now, don't just run on that instinct and go, oh, this is how it feels to me. Because one of the other challenges that we know from behavioral science is that it's something called the curse of knowledge. The more we know about a subject, the harder it is for us to put ourselves in the position of someone that doesn't. And if you're an expert in something, you are steeped in this stuff, you get it, your technical knowledge will be very high, your awareness of the risks will be very high. It is really hard for you to put yourself in a position of someone that doesn't get it, someone that knows nothing about this particular thing. And so we mustn't run on gut instinct in that situation. What we must do is to try and find out what it is like from their perspective, put ourselves in their shoes, really tread carefully around that. But use that visceral gut reaction that you had to some aspect of the COVID dynamic and say, okay, rules as designed theoretically do not always work. We need to understand that. So if you take that, plus that recognition that you can't easily always put yourself in other situations, you're going to make a real effort to do it. Suddenly you can start to see how, if my job is trying to influence other people, that maybe having an understanding of how that works could be incredibly helpful, because it'll help me to get a better answer than if I just do it by guesswork or the thing that we've always done. And the big risk is that when things don't work out, what people tend to do is double down on what they've done before, right? So population doesn't do what we want. More training, right? More training, more controls, more reviews, more blah, 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 blah. What happens if the training is the problem? And one of the challenging things that I do with lots of my clients is to say, guess what? Maybe we should do less. Maybe you've just done that bit too much, or do something completely different. And that feels really risky, right? Removing a control, doing less training, but that might be the answer. And so we have to be open to the fact that the approaches that we have adopted thus far, if they are not working, then maybe doing more of the same isn't the right answer. Maybe we need to try something different.
And it's about kind of putting your ego aside when you're doing stuff like that, when it, making those hard recognitions that, yeah, maybe you're not right in this instance. And I think in terms of cybersecurity, one of the sort of mantras that you always hear in conferences, wherever you go, is the foundation of security is people, processes, and technology. But we always really focus predominantly on the tech side, kind of like this silver bullet that's going to protect us. But when it comes to the people and processes side, I think we'll do really badly at engaging people. The language we use is just horrific to describe people. If someone clicks on a phishing link, for example, quite often the mantra is, oh, well, they're stupid. It's nothing to do with the fact that maybe we haven't trained them right. Maybe we haven't prepared them for this type of attack. No, they're stupid. They clicked on the link. We say things like zero trust to describe our threat landscape. That sounds great. That really is going to endear me. And we call people the weakest link. Could they be our strongest link? Which is the sort of thing I'm trying to push at the moment, is try and change that mindset of, these people are only smart at the things we teach them, tell them, show them. But if we gatekeep all that knowledge, they're never going to learn, and they're never going to be that great asset that they could be. Because going back to a point I made earlier, there's only ever a few of us in cybersecurity teams in most organizations. Unless you're a massive organization, your cybersecurity team is usually really tiny. If you have one at all, sometimes that's just ingested by the IT teams. So you've got to do a lot with a little. And, you mentioned earlier about when things go wrong, testing positives, testing negatives, how can you prove that something is working if you haven't been breached? Doesn't mean that you haven't stopped attacks, but there's just this whole sort of narrative behind that. You just have no idea. So when you're thinking about, as I say, it's people, process, technology, how do we get cybersecurity individuals to focus away from their reliance on technology to keep our organization safe and leverage our people against a common cyber threat?
Yeah, so I think I'm reminded of the old joke about, there are only two industries in the world that refers to its customers as users, and that's drug dealers and the IT industry. And I think it's a joke, but there is something in that. And I think it's almost the attitude is sometimes, oh, well, if it wasn't for those pesky people sitting behind a key, it's almost like the Scooby-Doo logic. If it wasn't those pesky kids, right, everything would be okay. If it wasn't for those pesky users doing stupid things with their systems, we'd be fine. And the phishing test example that you give, I think, is a really, really good one. So I have a very simple mantra, and I use it in the context of rules, but we can apply it to what you're talking about here, which is to say, if one or two people break a rule, then you've probably got a people problem. If lots of people are breaking a rule, you've got a rule problem. So let me just unpick that. So what I'm saying is, if lots of people are able to comply with a particular rule, but a few people can't or won't, then that suggests that the problem is with those people. Because if everybody else can manage to do it, but they can't, why is that? Now, it might be they're in a very, very unique set of circumstances that explain why that's happening. So I wouldn't rule that out. But broadly speaking, if most people can comply with something and a couple of people can't, then it points to the people being the problem. But if you've got lots of people not doing something, then the likelihood is that there will be some reasonable explanation, at least from their perspective. And so we automatically assume that, we've got widespread misbehavior, miscreants, lots of people not following this rule. if you dive into that, often you find there's a really good reason that's driving that. It's not them setting out to break the rules, because the vast majority of people come to work every day trying to do the right thing, right? They're not deliberately setting out to screw up. So if you've got a lot of them screwing up, from your perspective, try and find out what the cause of that is. And the analogy I always use is traffic. Of course, we hold people accountable for when they have accidents, but when we have a stretch of road where there are lots of accidents, we don't just always sit there and blame the drivers. What we do is we look at say it's a junction, we go look at that junction and say, what is it about this junction that is causing large numbers of accidents to occur here? We always draw conclusions about what can we do to change the junction to make it safer. That's not about letting drivers off, but it's about recognizing that the environment has somehow caused the problem. The consistent factor is this particular junction or certain weather conditions or whatever it is, and therefore we change the junction to make it safer. I would argue the same thing with things like phishing campaigns. Lots of people falling for them actually might not be them being idiots. It might be that, as you say, your training is terrible. And so putting yourself in the shoes of other people and recognizing that this narrative that we often have of, oh God, someone's not done something, they're an idiot. Well, they might be an idiot, and we're all capable of being idiots on some level, but there will be some reason why they came to the conclusion that that was the appropriate course of action. Very small percentage, as I said, will be doing it to break rules. But what's fascinating about that very small percentage is that if they are deliberately setting out to do something malicious, they're probably going to be hiding their tracks. They will pass all of the stuff that's obvious, right? If you really, really are an undercover nefarious agent, you're not going to appear on radars of doing stupid things, because you don't want to get caught doing that. So we need to catch them by different means anyway. They're not listening to training. If they are, they're looking for loopholes. But what we need to start to do is to recognize that the reason humans make decisions is on some level, there is something telling them to do that. Now, it might be that it's past experience that is useless, that they've always done something a particular way. It's irrelevant. They've come in from a different industry. They've never seen something like this before. We've explained it piss poorly, and therefore it's not clear to them. We think we've explained it clearly, but obviously we haven't. So the focal point, I think, really needs to be thinking about things from their perspective. And what fascinates me about most companies is that there's lots of effort put into customer experience. So we try and make things as easy as possible for customers, as slick as possible, because, well, hey, they pay the bills. And if we don't do that, they'll go to a competitor. That same logic is not deployed when it comes to employees with regards to compliance, training, restrictions, controls. Now, it's not the same relationship, and I'm not saying, the employee is always right? We can push employees to a certain extent. We have legal rights over them. What I call the employment contract fallacy. And the reason I say it's the employment contract fallacy is employment contract does legally give you the right to tell your employees what to do. And there are going to be times where you want to exercise that, no question. But we shouldn't rely on it all the time, because if we're pissing them off and asking them to do silly things, they are going to respond in kind. And if we want them to do things when we can't see what they're up to, when we don't actually, maybe we don't even know that it's happening, we'll find out afterwards, then we need to work with them and we need to think about things. And so stuff that is particularly irritating for employees is, yes, of course, we can get away with it and we'll do it to a certain extent. There are going to be times where you just want them to follow the rules, but there's lots of other times where you just go, should we really push them? And so the biggest question I think people can ask, if you want to find out where you have a potential weak point in your thing, is ask this simple question, which is, what pisses you off? And I phrase it in that slightly crude way deliberately, because I'm not interested in things that are slightly annoying. I'm interested in things that viscerally irritate the hell out of you that you do not understand or do not accept, because that is a weak point, because a rule or a law or a process that you don't respect is one you're going to try to circumvent. So that question, or a derivative of it, but it needs to be really provocative. If you get lots of people coming back with the same answer, that's a really good piece of feedback that you should action and not ignore. And it may be that you can't change the underlying process, but you can then think about, well, why do they think that? Maybe we haven't explained it properly. Maybe we can break this thing up to make it simpler. Maybe there's a one time where they need to do something that we're blocking that we could find a way through. But that is a key bit of feedback. And I think we don't listen to those people. Their views are almost irrelevant. It's a sort of take it or leave it thing. A bit like when I download a piece of software or an app, I'm required to accept terms and conditions. Right? We all just click through that stuff because there's no point in reading it, because I can't negotiate. I can't turn around to Apple or whoever and go, I don't like this, right? I just have to take it or leave it and I want to use the software. And that mechanism, and they know that as well, right? They know no one bothers reading this stuff, but there are certain legal constraints on it. We would hope that they won't have put anything outrageous in there, and we'll hope that it wouldn't stand up in court if it ever came to it. But when we're talking about employees, we shouldn't be putting them in that position where they just treat us like a thing to be got past. We need to work with them, and that involves showing them respect. and empathy.
Your book talks about the humans framework. Could you tell us and the listeners about it, please? And how you'd apply it to a typical situation in an organisation, kind of in the context of cybersecurity?
Sure. So humans is one of the frameworks that's in the book. And what I've tried to do here is this is not about every single aspect that will drive human decision making, but it is a start point of some factors to consider for one of two situations. Either if you are designing something and you want to design, and by something, I mean rule, training, communications, all of these things I use under the proxy of the word rules. If you're designing something, blank sheet of paper territory, you can start to think about, well, what will this feel like from the perspective of the target audience? In other words, the people that are going to have to follow this. You can also use it as a diagnostic tool where if people aren't doing what you want them to do, you can say, let's have a look at these factors and see if we can identify reasons why that might not be working. So it works both ways. And the idea behind it is there are a number of factors that we can think about that give us a sense of people's propensity to do what we want them to do, or in the case of something we're trying to stop, not to do that particular thing. And so it's an acronym. So each letter of the word stands for something different, and it's a dynamic that should set you off. So I'll take you through those very quickly, and then maybe we can think of an example to look at it. So the H of humans stands for helpful. And the idea behind that is think about from the perspective of the people you're trying to influence, so the employees, is what you are expecting or asking them to do helpful? I don't mean helpful from the perspective of the organization. I don't mean theoretically helpful from their perspective. I mean genuinely. Does this help? Does this take them further in their day or not? So if it's a health and safety thing, right, if it stops them getting killed or injured, they are more likely to, and they recognize that, they're more likely to find it helpful. It's not theoretically whether they should, it's practically whether they do. And we're talking all the time about things from their perspective. Second one is understand. And the question there simply is, do they understand it? And there's two things that you want to ask whether they understand. The first one is, do they understand what it is you want them to do? Because if you don't understand something, there is a lower likelihood of you actually being able to. You might randomly comply with the rule or requirement, do the right thing, but you might not. So the more we understand something, the more capable we are of doing it. Equally, the more capable we are of not doing it. So it's also worth that flip side. The second thing that's worth thinking about from an understand perspective is not just what they think about it, but what they think you think. And I'll unpick that. What that basically means is, if you're asking them to do something, do they think you understand what it is you are asking? Because very often we get instructions from on high that seem really, or from an authority that seem really easy, even theoretical, but are practically a pain in the butt. If I feel that you don't understand what you're asking me to do, you have no appreciation of the realities, that will potentially reduce my propensity to comply with things. So understand's a little bit complex, has all those nuances. M is manageable, which is how easy is it for somebody to do something? And we need to think about whether actually complying with this rule is going to be easy for them or not. And if something is harder, that is obviously makes it less likely that they're going to do. It doesn't mean they won't, but it's just worth recognizing and saying, is this actually a massive pain in the backside? Can they actually comply with this? And often we impose rules on people, silly rules that make sense from a theoretical perspective, but stop something legitimate from happening. And so can they actually comply with this? Does this apply in all situations, or their time this might not apply? A is then acceptable, which is basically saying, is the rule acceptable to them? And this is not a legal question. This is a moral, ethical, sort of societal question about, do I think you have the right to tell me to? Do I think you've got the right to block me watching YouTube? Can you tell me as an employer that I can't have social media accounts? At some point, there are going to be restrictions that we put on people that they find unacceptable. Just because you can legally do it doesn't necessarily mean. The more acceptable I find it, the more likely I am to do it. The less acceptable, the less likely I am. And of course, that's a measure not just of what you're doing within the organization, other rules, but it's also other experiences people have. And we saw with COVID, government overreach. You can't tell me to do that. That same feeling will apply in an employment situation. And so if somebody has a friend who's working for a similar company and they don't have any of these restrictions on them, then that's going to feel weird. And so we will calibrate what's acceptable to us based on our past experience, but also things that are there. And so again, not saying that we make if we need some people to do something, then we just need to recognize if it is less acceptable to them, then we might have to work a bit harder at it, because it just illustrates that people might be less likely to want to do it. N is normal. That's basically saying, is this something that's regular, normal, standard for an employment situation, for the industry, for the society that you're in? Is this a normal thing they're asking me, or is it weird? And the weirder, the more abnormal it is, the less likely we are to want to do it, the more it'll stand out. And again, not saying that we change anything, but just recognize the dynamics that were there. S is the most difficult one to explain, which is why it's last, which is S is for salient. And salient is a word that basically means, has it grabbed my attention? Am I aware of it? And so if we drive the Barbie advertising campaign for movies, that is very, very salient. That pink screams out on posters, unless you're colorblind, of course, in which point it's less. So things that stand out, but after a while, of course, those ads become less salient because we've seen them so frequently. So salience has it grabbed my attention? Is it there? So partly that's about, do they even know that this is a thing? Have we taught them? Are they aware of this particular thing? Or is it uppermost in their minds at a particular point in time? And we often train people on things in the classroom and maybe during their induction training. We don't think about, is this likely to be salient to them when it matters? And if we've got a particular process thing we need them to think about at a moment in time, then if we can identify ways to communicate it to them when it's relevant, it'll seem more salient. Rules about what you can do when you're traveling seem more relevant when you are about to go traveling. So the airline safety briefing, we don't send them a YouTube link 6 months before you get on the plane. You get it just before you're about to take off, when it is most relevant, therefore most likely to get through to you because it's salient. So the factors in humans there are things that we can think about to recognize whether something is landing well. I'll put it in very loose terms to continue the aviation analogy, landing well with our population. And therefore, what we can do is start to say, well, where do we have particular challenges? Now, some of these things might not apply in all situations, but we may, when we come across something that we're trying to review or design, we may say to ourselves, there are one or two of these that stand out, right? It's either particularly positively or particularly negatively, and that's where we can start to play with it and say to ourselves, what can we do? So if something is deemed to be incredibly unhelpful, it's a pain in the butt, I hate this thing, can we make it less of a pain in the butt? Or do we say to ourselves, okay, they think it's a pain in the butt, maybe I can make it feel like it's less of a pain in the butt, chunk it up, break it up, whatever. Or I might say, there's nothing I can do about it. It's the worst, god-awful thing. Are there other factors I can play with? Can I move the dial elsewhere, recognizing that that one can't shift? And maybe if I can make the overall burden on people feel different by making it, I don't know, it's incredibly unhelpful, but we've made it really easy for them. It's incredibly unhelpful, but we've explained to them why we have to do this, and therefore their level of understanding is increased, and therefore it compensates for it. So that's basically how it works. And people often say to me, is there a scale there? The answer is you can, but the trouble is, how do you quantify helpfulness as opposed to salience, right? It starts to become very, very judgmental. And so, if you had a scale of 0 to 100 for each, I'm not sure that one dial point of helpfulness equates to one dial point of understanding, or vice versa. It's so you can use it in that, and you can of course compare A and B and say in terms of helpfulness, which one scores higher and lower. That you can do, but within it, not particularly helpful. But so people often try and quantify it. It's not designed for that, but you can do that. So pick something that you want people to do or not do.
Okay, I don't want them to click on unsolicited emails for potential risk of, could be a fish.
Okay, so let's just quickly go through that. So is that rule helpful? Well, the question would be, right, what is their understanding of that particular rule? Do they know why that rule is there? And is your implementation of that rule clunky in the sense that your decision to police that is basically quarantine any email that looks at all, or you're going to remove links from emails, right? If it's just, we don't want you to do this, and you've explained to you why, and it doesn't impact my life, I might go, well, that's not, maybe it's neutral on it, or actually it's quite helpful, right? They're trying to protect us, we don't want to fall for stuff. But if you're chucking anything that looks moderately suspicious somewhere else where I may not see it, I could miss a whole load of things. If you prevent me from clicking through legitimate links, then that starts to get unhelpful. So the helpfulness piece isn't necessarily the substance, it's maybe how you've responded to it. So I judge there and say, what are we doing at the moment, or what are we proposing to do? How does that feel on a helpfulness scale? The more of a pain you are, the more you make me do extra work, the less helpful you are, the more I feel like sense of protection you're there. So that's helpful. You, for understanding, is a question of how well have you trained them? Have you taught them why this matters, or have you just said, don't do this? Right, and you haven't illustrated why that's a potential risk. And of course, remember, all of these things are from their perspective. So if we're looking at helpful as an example, how does it feel to me? And the understanding is a very, very personal thing. So it's not about should they theoretically, do they actually understand it? Have you got it through to them? Have you told them stories about where things have gone wrong? Have you shown them how they could lose money in their own bank account? It could, if it can impact them personally, then that's a much stronger message. So the understanding bit is again, you have to make a judgment call about it. M for manageable depends what you're asking them to do. Are you asking, do you want them to go to a quarantine box anytime anything with a link comes in? well, that starts to become less manageable than if it's just watch out when these things come through. Chances are there'll be some forms of restriction. Are you sure you want to click this link type warnings? How many of those do they have to click? How easy is it? What volume of emails are people getting? For somebody who gets very few emails, then managing the process of thinking this through is much easier than someone that's getting stacks of them. So is there a way that you can look at that and say heavy email users, or at least those getting the most, maybe we need to focus on those people separately and not burden people who pose a lower risk with some of these challenges. So manageable, again, very personal. And to your point, Leanne, we need to think about the risks that people pose. For the email thing, anybody who is receiving more emails from outside or more clickable emails, on the one hand, means they pose a greater risk because there's more of them coming in volume-wise. But equally, it means that maybe they're more savvy about these things because they've seen it more frequently. The flip side of that being, of course, you get comfortable and you just, I know what I'm doing. This is not for me. I don't pay any attention. So there's a balancing act here, but the manageable will depend on their individual circumstances. Acceptable will depend entirely on what you are asking them or telling them to do as to whether they want to accept what you're saying. If it blocks emails, if it restricts what they can do, that's potentially unhelpful. I love lots of organizations have phishing buttons where you get something in, you can send it, you just click the button, it gets rid of the problem. That, I think, is a good example. I used to use that for bureaucratic processes I thought were ridiculous internally. Click it, get rid of the problem. Well, no, because I always used to say, they would say, this is not a phishing campaign, it's a serious email. I said, that can't be right because this looks so stupid and bureaucratic that it just looked like a phishing campaign to me. No serious function within this organization would send something that ridiculous. Forget it. That's a clearly phishing campaign. Right? Those people should then go on a training course, right? Because they are actually undermining your program. That is a really good proxy metric for are people aware of it, right? So they have thought about it. They know to send it to you. All of those things, brilliant, right? Tick, tick, tick. I'm not saying that you measure it absolutely and go, lots of people did that, so it's successful, but it's a good indicator that at least those people you've got through to. But I would be sending the creator of the email and the whole of that team on special training for two reasons. One is they have not thought this through, and therefore they clearly don't understand the substance of it. So extra homework for them. But the second thing is, if you're in a position to send emails like that out, you are holding in your hand a weapon of mass destruction from an undermining the cybersecurity program. And so they need to go through special training. So one of the things I'd be looking at for those things is to support your program is you don't want anybody sending something internally that could be mistaken for that particular thing, that could cause levels of concern, extra work for you, and demonstrates a general lack of cyber hygiene within the organization. So I'd be targeting people like that and saying, we need to hit those hard. You'll make fans with everybody because nobody likes receiving tedious bureaucratic emails. But secondly, it's a serious point, is they don't understand the substance. And that's a great bit of evidence that one might otherwise miss. Tick success for people got in touch with you, absolute big red cross for that function. And they should be sitting an extra, that shouldn't be everybody needs to have greater cyber. There you go. You've got some evidence that this particular function and probably others like it aren't there. That I think is powerful. Where do we got to? M for manageable, A for acceptable. Well, what are you asking me to do? Is it particularly difficult or clunky? How does that feel to me relative to? And remember that lots of cyber experiences are things that we compare with our private lives. One of the joys for me for working for myself is that I get to decide which software the company uses, right? And so I have stopped using lots of bits of software that I thought were the only bits of software in town for corporates because I just think they're awful, they're clunky, they're not great, they don't do what I need them to do. Now, I'm not suggesting that big companies should allow employees to use what the hell they want. There's good reasons why we restrict that. But the benchmark for user friendliness, usability, what makes a sensible restriction is people's private lives. And so if the UX on a particular system is clunky, people are going to compare that to Netflix. They're going to compare it to stuff that they use in their private lives. Often we think about the benchmark and going, well, this is by our standards, this is very good. That's not good enough. And particularly when people are working remotely, the comparator, and this also brings us on to salient, what grabs people's attention, the bar has been raised massively by the pandemic. Because if you're sitting at home, your comparator isn't Microsoft blah, it's whatever other things I use. And so that's the game, that's the game changer. It's the game changer for grabbing people's attention, but it's also the quality of the user experience. So things that are acceptable and let's bring us into normal, we shouldn't be comparing just to work scenarios. We should be going, what do these feel like in life? And would we put a customer through this? And if we wouldn't put a customer through this, why the hell do we think it's okay to put an employee? Because guess what? They're both human beings. So acceptable is how acceptable do I find what being asked to do? Normal is this a standard process? Are you getting me to do something that is so weird that if I were to do it in my private life, I'd be balking at it. Probably worth rethinking, particularly where you've got people remotely, because they are maybe going to be multitasking between their personal stuff and their work stuff and flipping between devices. And if I'm not doing it on my own personal device, then I might need some help in explanations as to why that makes sense for that bit. So all of these comparators with people's private lives, I know it sounds facetious. People go, well, we're not Netflix or we're not whatever. We should be thinking in those terms. So acceptable will compare to what else am I being asked to do within work? What else do I see other people? I'm not saying they're the same, right? And we can impose, but we just need to be, that should be the benchmark for thinking about these things. So acceptable is that acceptable? Normal, is that something I ordinarily do? You know, we're all used to the idea of email being sent to a spam folder, right? If you've got Gmail at home, that same thing happens. So that idea is fine. But if you want me to then go log into some hyper complicated system that I can't remember the password for, that you've made hyper secure, which traps things in there for decades, and I have to answer 500 questions to get them out, not desperately. And you know, you want things that learn. So I don't mind going through a tedious, it's acceptable to me to have to go through a tedious process once to whitelist a particular domain or a particular type of email. If I have to do it every time, something that may be acceptable the first time may not be the second, third, fourth, or fifth. And the more times I have to do it, the more annoying it becomes. So acceptable can shift over time. Normal, we've talked about. And then salient, the question would be there, well, how do you know whether it's salient or not? Well, people coming forward and saying, here's a problem. It's clearly salient to those people. They have thought about it. And one of the things you might want to do with that exercise is to say, okay, let's imagine this was a nefarious phishing email. We know it's not, right? What percentage of people thought in those terms? And is there anything that we can learn from that that might inform how successful we've been? Maybe there's a particular area of the business that's responded really well. And therefore we'd say, look, they seem to be more cyber aware. And actually, maybe there's a note to go out to the people in that function, not the head of the function, go, congratulations, there's something about your people's culture that's great. So the negative message to the purveyors of this awful email is but there's a positive one to those people, say, thank you so much. Can we learn anything about why it was more salient for those people than others? And so, you know, that's a really good illustration. And I think that's a perfect example of where you might say, we don't need to send a phishing email to that team, because they've just demonstrated that they've got it. Let's not focus it there. Let's focus our efforts somewhere else. So we can learn things from that particular piece. But if we wanted to know from their perspective, it's like, well, what evidence do we have for them being cyber aware or not? And that's the logic that leads you to phishing campaigns. So that's a quick sort of run through of the ways that one might think about using the framework.
Amazing. Now, we could talk all day, Christian, I'm sure.
I definitely can. Yeah.
I think your humans framework, if that's not an indication for our listeners to run out and buy your book, I don't know what is, because I think in terms of cybersecurity, I can think of so many ways we could apply this into all the sort of interventions we try and do. On that note, Christian, please do plug your book, plug your podcast. I think everyone should hear what you do.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you so much. So easiest place to find me if people want to connect, and please do feel free. I know they say on LinkedIn, don't connect with anyone you don't know, but if you've been listening to me on the show and you've got this far through, then go for that. Just search for Human Risk on LinkedIn and you'll find me. The podcast is humanriskpodcast.com. There you can find all the episodes. We're up to about 240 something episodes and a ton more in the can already. So that's going to keep going for some time. Then the book is Humanizing Rules. And if you just go to humanizingrules.com, you can read the first few chapters for free. My publisher has generously put that out there, so you can get a flavor for whether it's the sort of thing you like or not. So those places, so humanriskpodcast.com and humanizingrules.com will get you well and truly into my world.
Well, I don't know about you, Jeff, but I am going to be using that framework in every organisation I work in going forward. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I think it's such an approachable way of introducing discussions around risk. And, you know, is this actually going to work? Is this framework going to be a success in my organisation?
Yeah, I love a good mnemonic, and this can help all of us when it comes to putting things in place that require a change in behaviour.
We hope you've enjoyed this second chat with Christian Hunt. Links to everything that's discussed in the episode can be found in the show notes. If you are interested in the Humans framework, it can be found in his book. Check out the show notes for a link to that, and you can get a free access to a few chapters. In the meantime, please do leave us a review and share with your colleagues and friends. That support really helps us bring on high quality guests like Christian into future episodes. So all that remains to be seen is keep safe, keep secure, and don't forget to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?